I'm Dr. Jane Burgess again, finishing up our basic diabetes educational program. This is the final module. We're going to be talking now about food and nutrition. And I have a little disclaimer I'm going to say here. I am not a dietitian, so you will be receiving a perspective from a clinician, a physician. But don't hesitate to seek out the services of your local dietitian to help clarify anything that you may not quite understand. Food is divided up into 3 macronutrients. The macronutrients are carbohydrates, fat, and protein. Now, all 3 of these macronutrients are very important for a healthy diet. Diets that eliminate one major macronutrient tend to be diets that are very difficult to stick with and follow over time. So we would prefer that you have a reasonable combination of all 3 macronutrients in your diet, specifically for your health. So let's talk about carbohydrates a bit more and break that down. Carbohydrates break down into sugars while being digested in the stomach and intestines. The sugar from the breakdown of carbohydrates then enters the bloodstream. Now, a typical normal pancreas will release insulin into the bloodstream to help drive the sugars into important tissues in your body. All your organ systems and tissues need nutrition to stay well and healthy and to perform their jobs and also to help you work. So insulin drives the glucose into the muscle, liver, and fat tissues and other organs that rely on blood sugar for nourishment and energy. Approximately 100% of all carbohydrates that you consume are broken down into sugar within the first 2 hours. So, in the world of diabetes management, to help control the postprandial rise of blood sugar, and let me define postprandial. Post meaning after, prandial meaning food. So to help control the rise of blood sugars after eating, we ask that you count your carbs so that you have a consistent amount of carbs at each meal. Carbs shouldn't be unlimited and free for all, especially if you have diabetes. And when we asked you to count your carbs, we just call it carb counting for short. So the current premise of diabetes management is that you eat a consistent amount of carbohydrate at each meal and snack, which allows your healthcare provider to match medicine to the carbohydrates that you're consuming. So let me give you an example. If for one breakfast, you may eat 45 grams of carb, and then the next day you eat 90 grams of carb for a breakfast. You're going to have variability in your blood sugar control. And so that's why we ask patients to do their best to have a consistent amount of carb at each meal. Now, you can vary that from meal to meal. So you might have 45 grams at breakfast and 60 at lunch and 75 at supper, which is fine to do as long as you're consistent in doing that. Okay, 2 other macronutrients are fat and protein. Now, fats and proteins don't really contribute much to the elevation of blood sugars, especially in that first 2 hours. But if you eat large amounts of protein, like a 6 to 10 ounce steak, you will see an elevation of blood sugar about 3 to 4 hours later as the protein eventually is broken down into glucose. Although we don't count fat grams and protein grams like we count carbohydrate grams, you still need to be aware that fat and protein contain a lot of calories per gram. In fact, carbohydrates and protein have 4 calories per gram, and fat has 9 calories per gram. So for those patients who are following a ketogenic diet that is 80% fat, you can see that they're taking in a fair amount of calories when they're eating fat. What are some examples of carbohydrates? Grains, pasta, rice, breads, cereals and crackers, pancakes and waffles, dried beans and soy products, fruit and fruit juices, vegetables, especially starchy vegetables like potatoes, peas, and corn. We call those the Indiana Three. Milk products, ice cream and yogurts, sweets and desserts, including table sugar, honey, syrup, and jelly, regular sodas, regular sports drinks and sweetened teas, chips, popcorn, pretzels, and rice cakes. So this is a pretty comprehensive list, but it is not an exhausted list of examples of carbohydrate. But I think it's pretty complete to give you an idea of what carbohydrates are. This is the Jane Bridges way of looking at food. If it isn't a meat, and it's not a fat, it's a carbohydrate, and it needs to be counted. And so that's a really simple concept to keep in mind when you're looking at the food that you're about to eat and you're going to work on counting how many grams of carb are in that meal. So what are fats? Fats are butters, oils, olives, avocados, nuts and nut butters, mayonnaise, salad dressing, and sour cream. Now, fat and protein delay the absorption of carbohydrate. In fact, I talked about that when we were talking about the treatment of hypoglycemia. I specifically said no peanut butter and no cheese or no fat and protein when you're trying to treat a low blood sugar. You only want to use carbohydrates because fat and protein dampen the postprandial spike. And so when you're treating a low blood sugar, we want to treat it and we want to treat it quickly. But when you're eating what we call a mixed meal, a meal with fat, protein, and carbohydrate, when you have all that together, it does help in reducing the postprandial blood sugar. So that's a good thing, actually. But when we're dealing with fats, here's another clue. You've got to really pay close attention to the portion size. I have patients who eat handfuls of mixed nuts, not realizing how many calories they're consuming. They think, well, nuts are healthy. Well, yeah, they are, but they are a fat and have a lot of calories in them. And so when patients are complaining about not being able to lose weight, this is one of the main issues. It has to do with the amount of fat and protein that they're consuming in addition to the carbohydrates. Protein is meat, our meats, poultry, fish, and seafood, eggs, and cheese. Protein, again, if eaten in large portions, will contribute to the rise of blood sugar about 3 to 4 hours after consumption. A typical portion size for protein, especially meats, poultry, and fish, is 3 ounces, or as they say, the size of a deck of cards. Now, for a lot of us, that's not very much. We tend to eat a lot of protein in our diets, but just be aware that a portion size is 3 ounces. Doesn't mean you can't have more. You just need to be aware of the contribution of calories from these larger portions of protein. All right, so let's talk about counting carbs. There are 2 ways of going about counting up your carbs that you are about to eat at your meal. One is to estimate the carbs based on a standard serving size, and that's the key to this, is what is a standard serving size. We in our country supersize everything, so understanding what a normal serving size is a learning process for most patients with diabetes. A typical standard serving size is around 15 grams of carb. Again, this is an estimation. It's close. So for example, a serving size of bread is 1 piece, and that is 15 grams of carb. Right? 1/3 cup of rice, that's not very much, but that's 15 grams of carb. So if you eat a cup of rice, that would be around 45 grams of carb. A small piece of fruit the size of a tennis ball is 15 grams, and this is an orange. Now, if you have a huge navel orange, that might be 30 grams. Or if you have a pound of a Honeycrisp apple, that probably is close to 45 to 60 grams of carb. So a standard serving size is 15 grams, and then you estimate from there on out based on how much you are consuming. Now, the other way to count carbs is to actually add up all the grams of carbs that you're consuming at a meal, which is more precise and actually the preferred method for people who have diabetes. So we look at a meal and we use food labels, apps, references, books to determine how many grams of carb are on that dinner plate that you're ready to consume. And again, we talked about having a consistent amount at a meal. So let's say for supper, I usually have 60 grams of carb at a meal. Well, we look at what we're eating. Do we have enough or do we have too much? Is there something I can do without tonight, maybe a smaller portion? Or do I need to add or double a portion if I don't have enough? There's always Google as well. You could get on your phone and ask Siri, hey, how many grams of carb are in a large navel orange? And Siri will give you a pretty good idea of how many grams of carb. Now, when we're looking at our plates of food, we have to use tools to determine how much we're consuming. And in order to do that, you'll need a food scale. And I would highly recommend buying a digital one at Walmart. They're pretty inexpensive, but they're incredibly helpful when you might need to weigh a food to start to train your mind about what a serving size is. But even if you weren't trying to stick to a serving size, if you weigh it, you'll know how much you're getting ready to consume, and then you can do the math and figure out how many carbs is in that serving size. You also need measuring cups. Every household should have a set of measuring cups and measuring spoons. These are incredibly important in determining how much you're consuming. In fact, the dietitian I work with, who also has diabetes, uses measuring cups as serving spoons. So she'll just put a measuring cup in the dish of food so that she knows about how much she is going to be eating. And so that's a nice little trick, is just use measuring cups as your serving spoons. Now, another inexact way of determining what your portion size is to use your hand. This is my least favorite, I've got to say. I think it's very inexact because everybody has different sizes of hands. But most of these serving sizes are related to a lady's hand. So that's very difficult for a man to do estimation using a hand. But anyway, a lady's fist is about 1 cup. Okay, a palm, just right here, small amount, could be anywhere from 1/3 to 1/4 of a cup. A good handful, let's say you grab popcorn, would be about 1/2 cup. A thumb, the total thumb is 1 ounce. Typically we talk of ounces of cheese, a stick of cheese, or the thumb could be a tablespoon. And then the tip of the thumb where you have your thumbnail would be a teaspoon. I think these are inexact, but if you ever get in a bind, because we don't expect you to carry your measuring cups and spoons with you wherever you go, you can use your hand to help estimate. But the most important thing you can do is to know and understand how to read a food label. Now, there are 2 things we focus on in the world of diabetes management when we look at food labels. Number 1 is the portion size, and number 2 is the total carbohydrates. We don't focus on grams of sugar, we focus only on the total grams of carbohydrate. Now, I want to say for the record that if you decide you want to eat more than one serving size, that's perfectly fine to do. You just do the math. So if you're going to eat 2 or 3 serving sizes, you would double or triple the grams of carbohydrate per serving. Or let's say I'm just going to eat half of a serving. Well, then you would cut the grams in half. So how you eat is actually up to you. You decide what your serving sizes will be. You'll decide how many grams of carb per meal you'll consume with our guidance, of course, and then do the math in regards to the amount of carbohydrate you're consuming. Again, we don't want you to focus on grams of sugar because you will underestimate the amount of carbohydrates that will cause your blood sugar to rise after eating. So please just focus on total grams of carbohydrate. So here's a nutrition label. This is just a basic label. You can see at the top, serving size. That's number one. You always focus on what that serving size is. And for this food, it's 1 cup. I like to look at calories, and I'll focus on calories here in a little bit. So 150 grams or 150 calories per serving. But go on down to total carbohydrates, and you'll see that this product contains 24 grams of carbohydrate. Underneath it, it talks about dietary fiber and sugars. So if you only looked at sugars and it said 1 gram, you might get the impression, oh, I can have a lot of this. Well, no, this food actually has a fair amount of carbohydrates per serving. Going back up to the serving size, right after that, you'll notice in parentheses, it says 40 grams of, and so what is that? Well, that is grams of weight. So let's say you didn't have a measuring cup, but you did have a food scale. Well, then you could weigh this product out to 40 grams, and that would be a serving size. So within the serving size, whether it's 40 grams by weight or by 1 cup, it contains 24 grams of carbohydrate. Here's another food label. This one is, the serving size is 1/2 cup dry. Now we think that this is a pasta, and whenever you cook a pasta, it doubles in size. So when you serve the pasta, you would actually be serving 1 cup. Even though it's in the label, it's based on its dry weight. So the weight of this pasta is 56 grams dry weight. Okay, it has 210 calories per serving, and notice the carbohydrates, 42 grams. Pastas are high in carbohydrates. Okay, and if you look below the carbohydrates, you'll see that there's 2 grams of fiber, 3 grams of sugar, and 37 other grams of carbohydrate. If you add the 37 to the fiber and sugar, that equals 42. So here's some more examples to reiterate what I'm trying to explain in regards to portion sizes and determining the amount of carbohydrates per what you choose to eat. So a serving size of a cereal is 1 cup that contains 21 grams of carbs. But I'm going to eat 2 cups this morning. I'm hungry. So 2 times 21 equals 42 grams of carb. And notice I abbreviated CHO in capital letters. That means carbohydrates. Another example, there's a serving size of animal crackers. That's 8 crackers that contains 15 grams of carb. So in the box, there's only 4 crackers left. So 15 divided by half the serving size is 7.5, or we'll round up and say 8 grams of carb. Or let's say I was going to eat 4 grams of cracker, but I dropped one on the floor. So, each cracker is about 2 grams of carbs. So if I only have 3 crackers left, that would be 6 grams of carb. Now, on to a serving of pasta. A typical serving of cooked pasta, those standard sizes I was talking about, is 1/3 cup, just like 1/3 cup of rice. Okay, but in this instance, for my meal, I want to eat a whole cup. So 14 grams times 3 would be 42 grams total per cup of cooked pasta. Now, how many carbs should I eat at a meal? All right. So for women, we recommend 30 to 45 grams of carb per meal. If you are a lady who does a lot of labor work, stick to 45. You may even need 60. If you are a lady that doesn't do a lot of physical labor or work, more sedentary, stick with the 30 grams of carb. For men, they always get a bit more. It would be 45 to 60 grams of carb per meal. But again, this could be adjusted. If you're a male who does a lot of physical labor, we may need to go on up to 75 grams at a meal, depending on your workload. If you're more of a sedentary man, I would stick with 45 grams of carb. Growing kids may require more. Now, our snacks are between 15 to 20 grams of carb per snack. And again, a snack is something that's small. A snack is not half a pizza. It is a small amount of carbohydrate just to tide you over, take away a little hunger in between a meal. But it is not meant to be a large carbohydrate serving. Now, this may not seem like much carbohydrate at a meal, but again, when we're using nutrition as a way of helping to lower our blood sugars, using a consistent amount of carbs at each meal seems to work really well for the majority of people who do that. And it allows us, again, to customize and tailor-make the diabetic therapeutic regimen to match the intake of food that the patient is doing. And I totally understand that we all have work schedules, we have busy lives, and so it's not always easy to eat consistently. And I get that. We just have to do the best we can in our circumstances. Now, I would also like to focus on calories because every day I have patients who come in and lament about how they are not able to lose weight. They will tell me, well, I'm counting my carbs. Well, that's great. But what about all the fat and protein you might be consuming as well? So, how many calories should I consume a day? The recommendation is about 10 calories per pound of weight. So let's say I weigh 200 pounds. So 10 times 200 would be about 2,000 calories per day. And providing I'm not interested in losing weight, I just want to know how many calories I should consume to maintain weight and be healthy and do my work, 2,000 would be appropriate. In reality, though, patients frequently consume more like 12 calories per pound. So 12 times 200 would be more like 2,400 calories. So let's say, though, you would like to lose a bit of weight. How do we do that? How do you know how many calories to consume per day? Well, first off, you have to determine how many calories you're currently eating. And if you find and discover, well, I'm actually eating 2,800 calories per day pretty consistently, then we recommend you subtract 500 calories from the total calories per day that you are currently consuming. So if I'm consuming 2,800, I subtract 500, let me drop my caloric intake down to 2,300 calories per day. That should allow you to lose 1 pound per week, providing you're consistent with that. You might do wonderful Monday through Friday, but blow it on the weekends and still not lose weight because you have increased your caloric content, significantly on a weekend. So understand how this weight loss comes about. You have to be consistent in what you do on a day-to-day basis to continue with your weight loss. Now, let's say you add in exercise. That helps propel weight loss. It's incredibly important. So let's say you walk a rather vigorous walk for 30 minutes. You'll be consuming around 300 calories, and that will help accelerate your weight loss, providing you don't come in from the walk and eat 300 more calories. So you have diabetes, and you know that you need to make some changes in your dietary habits. So what should you do first? First, you got to figure out, what are you actually doing? How many calories are you consuming? How many carbohydrates are you consuming? So I recommend that you start to do a food diary where you write down every day everything that you consume, and make sure you measure it out so you have an idea of how big your portion sizes are. And then use references to look up the caloric content of food and the carbohydrate content of food. Now, when you do these diaries, make sure you include a weekend, because weekends can be much different than Monday through Friday. All right? So you've got everything written down, and now you're going to use resources. And I'll give you a list of resources, but there are apps and books and references that you can use to look up the foods that you're consuming, and hopefully glean a lot of information from doing that. And make sure you include all your snacks throughout the day. These sleeves of peanut butter and crackers and cheese and crackers add up. They're about 240 calories. They are definitely not a snack. Okay, they are like a little meal in and of themselves. So you've done your analysis. You've discovered that, wow, I'm eating a lot of carbohydrates at my meals. So you've discovered that, for instance, that maybe you're eating 100 grams of carb, and you are going to heed the recommendation of 60 grams at a meal. So how do I start to get rid of 40 grams of carb at each meal? Well, can you reduce a portion size? Can you eliminate a food altogether that you may not need? It doesn't have to be drastic. Make gradual changes towards that 60 grams of carb. Okay. Let's say you discover that the carbohydrate content of your meals isn't too bad, not far off goal, but the caloric content of the food is highly significant. Again, that's the contribution of the fat and protein that you get from processed foods, fast foods, and dining out. So how can you reduce the caloric content of your food? Well, smaller portions of meat. Be very cognizant of the fat content of food. All that may allow you to reduce the caloric content and reduce your total daily intake of calories that might allow you to lose some weight. Ask yourself, what can I do without? Again, double portions, the snacks in between meals. Can you go without a snack? Sometimes snacking becomes a habit. You know, we get a break at work. Well, great, I'll eat something. Can you go without that, or have something that's very low in calories, or a non-caloric drink of some sort? So you'll have to first discover what you're currently doing and what you're willing to go without, and where you can make those changes. Doesn't have to be drastic. Work towards the goal. You may also discover that you're not eating enough carbohydrates at a meal. So let's say you're eating barely 15 grams of carb at a meal. Well, then add in another serving of carb to get up to 30 grams of carb. Carbs give us energy, give us the ability to do work and to feel good while doing that work. So carbs aren't a bad thing. We just need about the right amount, not too much and not too little. So let's make some meals using food models and demonstrate portion sizes and what a typical meal could look like for you. So here's a typical breakfast. 3/4 cup blueberry, 1/2 cup of oatmeal, not very much. We tend to eat a lot more oatmeal than that. And 1 piece of bread, which would be 15 grams of carb. Notice there's some peanut butter. Usually that's typically a tablespoon of peanut butter. And then coffee. Now, peanut butter has no carbohydrates. Remember, it's more of a fat. So we have 15 grams for the piece of bread, 15 grams for the blueberries, 15 grams for the oatmeal. So that comes to 45 grams per breakfast, or per this breakfast. And of course, you have black coffee, and that has no carbohydrates unless you add sugar and milk. Here's another example of a breakfast. So you have 2 eggs that are scrambled. Again, eggs are protein. They have no carbohydrate. You have a pretty large banana, and actually this would be 2 servings. So this would be around 30 grams of carb. Bacon has no carbohydrates. Again, it's fat and protein. And then you have 2 pancakes, which I believe is close to 15 grams of carb. And then don't forget the syrup that you might put on it. That would have to be covered as well. So with the large banana and the pancakes, again, this is another 45-gram breakfast. With the addition of syrup, it could be upwards of 60 grams of carb for this breakfast. Here's an example of a lunch. This is 1 cup of beef stew with vegetables, about 15 ounces of grapes, and usually 1 grape is 1 gram of carbohydrate. And then there's a salad with ranch dressing, so it's about 2/3 cup of salad with 1 tablespoon of dressing, and then we have a cup of milk. So how many grams of carb in this food? Usually 1 cup of a broth-based soup like this stew would be around 15 grams of carb. Again, there's going to be meat and vegetables in it, and so most of those don't contain carbohydrate unless we're dealing with potatoes and things like that. The grapes, about 15 grams of grapes would be 15 grams of carb. And then your salad is barely 10 grams of carb. With 1 tablespoon of dressing, that's a fat, that wouldn't count. Milk is around 12 grams of carb. So this lunch is around 45 grams of carb. Notice how we're estimating, but we're coming pretty close. Here's an example of another lunch. 2 tacos and each tortilla. Now these are the smaller tortillas, are around 15 grams of carb. And then you have guacamole and salsa. Well, guacamole is a fat that would not contain carbs. Salsa, a little bit like this, I probably would use that as a freebie. The tortilla chips, this model is 15 to 20 chips or 3/4 ounce. Might be 15 grams, but may also be 30 grams. So read your label when you're eating tortilla chips. And then you have a beer. And beer is not considered to be a carbohydrate. We count alcohol as a fat. So in this instance, another 45-gram carb meal. Here's an example of a dinner. This is an 8-ounce steak. And remember, no carbs in that meat. It's not a carbohydrate, but 8 ounces carries some significant calories. And this is 3/4 cup of French fries. I think this is a double size, so I'm going to call that 30 grams of carb. And then you have 2 servings of asparagus. Now, half a cup cooked asparagus is 5 grams of carb. So there are 2 half cups here. So this would be 10 grams of carb, 30 grams of carb. So we're around 40 grams of carb per meal. And then you'll have the glucose contribution from a large piece of meat. And of course, hopefully this is a Diet Coke for you, but in my food model, this is a Diet Coke that would have 0 carbohydrate. So here's a dinner, and we have 1 cup of pasta, which is going to be around 45 grams of carbohydrate, and it has 2 meatballs, so that would not contribute carbohydrate. So I'm going to say 1 cup of this pasta is around 45 grams of carb. You have 2 servings of broccoli, and again, a half a cup cooked vegetable, green vegetable, is around 5 grams of carbs. So we have 10 grams of carb plus the 45, we're up to 55. Now we have 1 breadstick, and this is 15 grams of carb. And then we have a dessert. a cupcake. And so a small cupcake with frosting is around 30 grams of carbs. So this is a much larger meal. And of course, we have the glass of wine. A wine we would not count as a carbohydrate unless it was a pretty sweet wine, but in this instance, it's a red wine. So to estimate or come close to what this meal contains, 45, 60, 90, and 100. So this is 100 grams of carbohydrate in this dinner. So you've been invited to a birthday party and you are served a layer of chocolate cake and half a cup of ice cream. Half a cup of ice cream is going to be 15 grams of carb. And I have a feeling looking at this cake, this is going to be anywhere from 30 to 45 grams of carbs. So this plate of dessert is going to be upwards of 60 grams of carbs. So read your labels, look it up, but I have a feeling the size of this cake is very close to 30 to 45 grams. With the ice cream, again, we're going to be talking about 60 grams of carb here. So here's a hot fudge sundae as an example of a dessert or a snack. And so it's 1 cup of ice cream, which is going to be around 30 grams of carb plus 2 tablespoons of the fudge syrup. And so this is going to come close to around 45 grams of carb. So when we talked about calories and portion size, consider just having 1 half cup scoop of ice cream instead of a full cup as a way of satisfying your craving for sweets, but yet keeping your caloric content down. Here's a continental breakfast. This is a cinnamon roll and 1 cup of orange juice. Now, a serving of orange juice is just a half a cup, so this would be a double serving. And I'm going to look at this cinnamon roll and estimate that it is around 30 grams of carb for the cinnamon roll and maybe another 15 grams just for the frosting. And then the orange juice is 30 grams. So we might be talking around a 75 gram carbohydrate breakfast here. So here's some important food facts that you also need to keep in mind as you analyze your food. You might be at the grocery store and see a label that says net carbs. We prefer that you just ignore that. Always look at that label, look at your portion size and your total grams of carbohydrate, but don't be misled by a concept of net carbs. That's a marketing ploy, and that's not something we use in the world of diabetes management. A product may say sugar-free or no sugar added. Now, that doesn't mean it is unlimited and you can eat as much of it as you want. Sugar-free and no sugar added products still have carbohydrates and they still have calories. So continue to read the label on the package. Note that caffeine, especially a lot of caffeine and coffee in the morning, can raise your blood sugars. A lot of times patients say, but I don't eat breakfast. But then I inquire, how much coffee might you be consuming? Well, a half a pot. Well, caffeine is a stimulant and it does raise blood sugars. And for some of my patients on insulin who have significant rise in blood sugar with coffee, we even have them take what's called a wake-up bolus of insulin to control what caffeine does to their blood sugars. So be aware, black coffee has no carbohydrates, but it's got caffeine that can raise your blood sugars. Condiments have sugars in them. So ketchups and barbecue sauces are not free. Look them up. You'll be surprised how much sugar you'll find in them. So those need to be counted as well. A good rule to remember is that A cup of casserole, a fist-sized cup of casserole, is usually around 30 grams of carb. So if you get invited out to a dinner somewhere and they're serving casseroles, a cup is 30 grams. Now, the calorie count can vary depending on the amount of fat and meat that's in that casserole. But in regards to carbohydrate content, it's about 30 grams of carb. Casseroles like this would be tuna and noodle, or chicken and rice, or lasagna, for example. Fiber helps dampen the postprandial spike of blood sugar. So just like that mixed meal of carbohydrate, fat, and protein, fiber can also help lower the postprandial spike, and that's a good thing. It is currently recommended that you consume 25 to 30 grams of fiber per day, but that's very hard for us to do in our culture and the way we eat. But just be aware that fiber can be very helpful in dampening that postprandial spike. Now, if you find a food that's high in fiber and it has 5 or more grams of carbohydrate, you subtract the total amount of fiber from the total grams of carb per serving. Okay, so for instance, you have a cereal, probably like a Fiber One cereal, that has 42 grams of carb per serving and it has 8 grams of fiber in it, then 42 minus 8 is 34 grams of carb, and that's what you would count instead of the 42. So that gives you a little bit more room to add milk to your cereal. So here's a nutrition label of a high fiber product. Serving size is 1 cup, calories are 290, total grams of carb are 41 per serving, and notice dietary fiber is 10 grams. So you can subtract the full amount of fiber from the total grams of carb. So 41 minus 10 is 31 grams of carb per serving. Let's talk about artificial sweeteners now. Artificial sweeteners are fine to use in moderation. Stevia is the most natural. I do think we lean towards the sweetener that tastes best to us. So some people prefer a pink packet or a blue packet or a yellow packet or a green packet. Used in moderation, I just don't have a problem with that. To excess, I do have a problem with that. So, you can sweeten a drink or a cereal. That's fine to do, but we don't want to be using a lot of artificial sweetener throughout the day if we can avoid it. But again, keep in mind stevia or the green packets are the most natural sweetener that we have. Sugar alcohols are not alcohol, but are modified sugar molecules that sweeten products like candy and gum. Now, just note they contain calories and carbohydrates. So just because they're sweetened artificially with sugar alcohols doesn't mean they are free and unlimited. Be aware that too much sugar alcohol, like sorbitol, erythritol, when taken in large amounts, can have a laxative effect. These products affect your GI tract, so you can have GI distension and gas and diarrhea, and can be pretty miserable if you overdose on these sugar-free products. So again, these products need to be in definite moderation because of the side effects that they can cause. Now, if your candy or sweet has 5 or more grams of sugar alcohol per serving, you can subtract 1/2 of the total grams of sugar alcohol from the total grams of carbohydrate. So for example, you have a no sugar added ice cream bar that has 20 grams of carbohydrate, of which 6 grams is a sugar alcohol. So 1/2 of 6 is 3, so 3 from 20 would be 17 grams of carbohydrate per serving. And if you recall, I said a snack should be between 15 to 20 grams of carb. Well, this would make a nice little snack or treat for someone. Here's another food label that shows that no sugar added ice cream bar. Again, the serving size is 1 bar, 210 calories, 20 grams of carb, but notice the sugar alcohol. So you would take 3 grams from the 20 for 17 grams total. So we ask you to eat a consistent amount of carbs at your meals. We really feel that that's important and incredibly helpful in controlling your blood sugars. But again, pay attention to the total amount of calories that you're consuming each day. Resources to help you figure out how many carbs and calories that you're consuming are numerous. You can Google and find a whole lot of them. But the gold standard that we like is called Calorie King. This is a book that you can probably pick up at Walmart or on Amazon.com. It is an app for your phone or for your tablet. This book offers just a tremendous amount of information in regards to calories, fat, protein, carbs, all the nutrients, macronutrients in the food. It also offers guidance on all the fast food restaurants, the chains, and all your foods that you would buy in a grocery store. So it's very comprehensive and is one of the gold standards we use in the world of diabetes. Another app that we like is MyFitnessPal. And what's really nice about this is that you could put in your meal and it will give you all the nutrient content, calories, carbs, everything you would want to know, and it keeps track of them. So you know each day you can know your total calorie count, and then you can look at it over a week at a time. You can also put in your own personal recipes, and it will produce a food label for you. So that's also very helpful for those old family recipes that you like to make, and you just want to know how many carbs and how many calories per serving of that recipe. Lose It is another app. Carbs Control is another suggestion. But again, you can Google and search for other books and references that can all be helpful. There's something I want to talk more about in regards to a class of drugs I mentioned earlier called the SGLT2 inhibitors and how it relates to carbs and alcohol. So if you are taking oral diabetes meds called either Jardiance, Farxiga, Invokana, or Steglatro, you must eat carbs in your diet. A ketogenic diet, which is upwards of 80 to 85% fat, is actually contraindicated. It is not appropriate when you are taking these medications because it can lead to diabetic ketoacidosis. And we have seen diabetic ketoacidosis in patients with type 2 diabetes. It's not just for patients with type 1. So this is very significant and important to keep in mind. Let's say you are NPO or nothing by mouth for a procedure like a colonoscopy or a surgery. Again, you want to not take your Jardiance or whatever SGLT2 inhibitor you're taking because, again, you need to consume carbs to take this medication. Excessive alcohol is also contraindicated when taking these meds, as it can also lead to diabetic ketoacidosis. So alcohol should be used in moderation carefully. So what other resources are available to you? Seek out the services of a dietitian to help you with meal planning if you're struggling with all this, because I know I'm giving general recommendations, but if you're a person who really needs specific guidance, seek out the services of a dietitian. Now, your healthcare provider usually knows who the local dietitians are and can make that referral. Here at Good Sam, we have the Welch Diabetes Educational Center, and their number is 812-885-8010. And there is a new center in Washington, Indiana, the Walker Wellness and Diabetes Education Center, and their number is 812-642-5060. So thank you for completing this basic education course. You've spent a lot of time with me, probably upwards of 3 hours, and that's a lot of education. But you can see diabetes is not an easy disease. It can be very complicated, and trying to figure out all the things that you need to do to help have better health, to live well and live long with diabetes. And so at the end of this program, don't hesitate to print off your certificate, Take that to your physician so they know that you've completed this 3-hour program, and make sure you write down your questions so that they can help clarify some things for you. So again, thank you for joining me on this basic education class.